Well, today is going to be a relatively brief program because in some ways there isn't a huge amount more to report on what one might describe as the great global crisis, the crisis centered on Ukraine. Now, can I, before discussing this global crisis or further, just make one further observation? Since 1945, since the end of the Second World War, there have been many wars around the world. There have been wars in Vietnam, there have been wars in the Middle East, there have been wars in Central Africa, there have been wars in all sorts of places. What has made this particular war in Ukraine, which objectively is not on as large, and certainly so far hasn't gone on for anything like as long as any one of those, or as some of those other wars, what has made this a global crisis is the decision that the Western powers have made about it. They've used this war as grounds to launch a war, an economic war against Russia. And yesterday, as more sanctions were announced by the United States and as the European Union cranks up to announce still more sanctions, hasn't yet done so, but I expect there will be a decision made some point today, Thursday. As that has happened, it's been interesting to see a number of admissions squirreled away in articles in the Financial Times. Now, these admissions have been scattered over a relatively large number of articles, and they're very small, and as Financial Times articles are anyway, behind a paywall. I'm not providing links, but in summary, what these admissions say is that the Western powers assumed that the sanctions they announced at the end of February would be sufficient, and that they are somewhat astonished at being put in a position where they have to engage in still more sanctions because the sanctions that they imposed in February have not achieved the results they have, and that there are now growing concerns about the impact of these sanctions on the global economy. Well, as I've said many times, a lot of this ultimately stems from a massive misjudgment of the scale, diversity, depth of resources and resilience of the Russian economy, or of the quality of administrative and economic governance in Russia, as well as, by the way, a sense of a sense that waging this kind of economic war would consolidate Russian attitudes further behind their government. Now, yesterday, the United States imposed further sanctions. It prohibited any investment in the Russian economy at all. That is hardly going to have much effect in a time of sanctions, especially as the United States was never a major investor in the Russian economy. In fact, US investments in Russia have been on a very small scale. And of course, it's also announced further sanctions against Russia's biggest bank, Sberbank, full blocking sanctions as it's called. Well, Sberbank, which does the overwhelming bulk of its work in Russia, it's the Russian savings bank originally, with a history going all the way back to the 19th century, just shrugged its shoulders. And very gratuitously and very bizarrely, the US also announced further sanctions against Russian individuals, including President Putin's two daughters. Now, I have to say, sanctioning an individual's children in order to get through to him seems to me cruel. The justification is that they're involved in concealing his wealth, a wealth that has never been proved to exist. But having said that, there's no evidence that either of them have engaged in any wrongdoing. There's never been any suggestion that they've acted inappropriately or wrongly. At least I've not seen any such things anywhere in the West. In fact, not very much is known about them. they've managed to keep a fairly low profile, which, given that they are the daughters of the president of Russia, actually is quite remarkable and in some ways even impressive. So sanctioning these two women seems to me an astonishing and cruel thing to do. And I have to say, I can't see any conceivable justification for it. By the way, the Russians, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, is now quite openly inciting bondholders of Russian debt who are unhappy at receiving rubles instead of dollars in interest payments. He's basically inciting them to bring legal claims in anticipation that these will ultimately involve the US government, which after all is freezing the Russian reserves, which is making it more difficult, or rather I should say impossible, as the Russians claim, for them to pay the bondholders in dollars. We'll see what the bondholders do, but to be straightforward about it, I would have thought that in legal terms there is a potential case here, though whether or not the US courts would entertain it is of course a completely different matter. Meanwhile, as I said, the European Union is struggling with its own sanctions package. It's fairly minor. There's supposed to be an import ban on Russian coal. Reuters is saying that that's now been postponed till August. Coal is not a significant part of Russian exports to the EU, but the EU does buy Russian coal for a reason, which is that it needs thermal coal, and of course it also needs coal to fire up its blast furnaces and such things. And of course the EU for many years has been engaging in a policy of closing down its coal mines, because supposedly, well, because of the whole claims about climate change. It's very, very difficult to reopen closed coal mines once they've been closed. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's an expensive and very complex thing to do. The EU, therefore, sooner or later, because apparently if it's going to scale down imports of Russian gas, is going to have to increase use of coal, which will of course have an effect on carbon emissions. But besides, it's going to force the EU into importing more coal from countries like Australia, South Africa, and ultimately, I suppose, the United States. Now, the effect of that, needless to say, is higher carbon emissions in Europe, which one would have thought green ministers in the German government would not want, but there we are. And ultimately more expensive coal, because of course coal from Russia has to travel fewer distances. It can be supplied by train as well as ship, and of course it is produced cheaply, whereas coal in Australia and the United States, I'm guessing, is probably more expensive. Well, these are the decisions the Europeans are making. Olaf Scholz has already said that the era of globalization and cheaper prices is over, and from now on people in Germany are going to have to accept that they were going to have to live with much higher prices. Well, I have to say that's a political decision that the leaders of Europe have made. They're going to saddle their people with higher prices. I wonder what their people ultimately, in the autumn, when more of these bills start to fall, will think about that. But given the unity of the European political class in pursuing these policies, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to change things. Anyway, that's the position, it seems to me, with sanctions. I would just add one further point on this particular topic. As of the time of making this video, the ruble is indeed trading more strongly. It's actually stronger relative to the dollar and the euro than it was when the sanctions were first announced. Now, if you've been following the work of people like Tom Longo, whom I'm proud to say has joined us in a program on the duran, and I'm sure that we will be doing more with him soon, you would find that unsurprising. But I would say that it's perhaps unwise to dwell on this too much, because from a Western point of view, the fact that the ruble has not collapsed, that the Russian financial system has not collapsed, that there's not an existential economic crisis in Russia, is for the West, and perhaps specifically for the neocons in the United States, very close to being an existential issue. Now, can I just explain why? Firstly, the neocons and the neoliberals are still very much committed to the ideological project that the United States is the end point of history, that it is the future, that any other pathway to the future is wrong, and they are feverishly trying to make that future that they associate with the present situation in the United States. They're working feverishly to make that future happen. And of course, they've also, over the last 20 or so years, suffered a whole series, from their point of view, of defeats. The wars in the Middle East, for example, have not gone well. US manufacturing capacity has been overtaken by China's, and the gap is apparently still growing. And of course, there's also a certain perception that the United States is no longer quite the dominant military power that it was. Now, if you have a neocon outlook, on the one hand, you find it very difficult to accept these realities, but on the other hand, you also, at some deep level, are aware of them. And that makes you double down on those instruments of power which you believe you still have. And one of those instruments of power is, as they believe, the position of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and the dominant position the United States and the Western powers have, as they also believe, in the financial system. And the reason that over the last 20 years, and especially over the last 10 years, that we have seen this addiction to sanctions on the part of the United States and its allies in the European Union is because, from their point of view, it is sanctions which is the one big lever to promote their project that they still have. So, if that lever is shown to be broken, if it turns out that throwing sanctions at Russia is not going to break Russia or bend it to their will as they wish, then of course, from their point of view, the one remaining key lever of power is shown to be broken, and they are left with nothing in their toolkit. Now, at the moment, they're not prepared to accept that, and I suspect that they will not accept that for some time. So, bragging about the fact that the ruble is getting stronger is only going to provoke them to try to do worse. And that's essentially what those comments squirreled away in the various articles in the Financial Times say. Now, I'm not going to talk about what might happen next on the sanctions front. We are far beyond the point, in my opinion, of logic or reason or rationality, and any idea that anybody comes up with, even myself on this program, however crazy it is and however hypothetical it is, well, I am very concerned that somebody will listen to it and spread it around and then pick it up and then run with it. But when you are in the kind of mood that the neocons and the administration in Washington are in, then the risk, the real possibility that they will escalate to the point of destruction becomes very real. So I would suggest that we say a little less about the strengthening of the ruble at this particular point in time, because, as I said, I think it carries risks, certainly obviously for Russia, which would be the immediate target of these sanctions, but ultimately I fear for all of us. Now, On the military front, it's been interesting to see how reporting has changed. Whilst the Russian forces were camped around Kiev, it was possible for the Western media to recycle endless claims of Ukrainian victories in the battles around Kiev. It wasn't difficult because the Russians weren't advancing on Kiev, and of course the media was there, and it was relatively easy for the Ukrainians to pass off skirmishes as victories and to talk up what was going on in Kiev. Now that the real war has become concentrated increasingly to the east, where it always was, and to some extent also in the south, it's very interesting to see how, especially in the British media, actual reporting of the fighting has dwindled to a trickle. Western journalists do travel to some extent to the west, to the east, but to a very limited extent. And of course, anyway, the situation in the east is of renewed and continuous Russian advances. Now, there's apparently been quite a lot of developments. I'm not going to pretend that I'm fully up to speed with all of them, but in Mariupol itself, the Russians claim that the Ukrainian forces have now been reduced to 3,000. I've no idea how the Russians count these numbers, and that they are now isolated in 3 pockets: in the port area, in a factory called the Ilyich factory. That would, by the way, be a factory named after Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, presumably in Soviet times, and also the giant Azovstal factory. And there's now abundant video evidence that the Russians and their allies, specifically the Chechens in the Azovstal factory, are actually now fighting the Ukrainians in the precincts of these 2 factories, the Ilyich factory and the Azovstal factory. There's also word, by the way, that the position of the Ukrainian troops in the port area has become completely untenable, and that resistance there is about to collapse. Resistance in the 2 factories will probably continue for a little longer. Now, this has been by far the biggest battle fought in Ukraine up to now. It's involved by far the largest number of troops on either side. It's resulted in the single heaviest casualties that the Ukrainian military has suffered in this war. And if the battle ends with the Russians in full control of Mariupol, as I have discussed many times in lots of programs, then the very large forces that the Russians have had to commit to capturing Mariupol, Scott Ritter put them at around 40,000 men, are then available for release in other operations once they've been rested. Now, that doesn't mean that fighting isn't also going on elsewhere in Donbass. And it's increasingly clear, and I'm getting this now from Ukrainian comments, that the major source of alarm and concern for the Ukrainians is the continuing advances of the Russian forces south from Izium. And it seems that they're now closing in steadily and gradually and methodically on the 2 important towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which were, by the way, as I said previously, the major focus of the fighting in 2014. And I've seen some really rather sad, some tragically sad pictures of the railway station in Kramatorsk packed with civilians trying to flee the city before the Russian army arrives and the battle that many fear there starts to take shape. And these battles around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are widely expected to be the big battles in the east. This is where the major Ukrainian forces appear to be increasingly concentrating, where they are likely to make their last stand, or perhaps I should say their big stand. That doesn't mean that fighting isn't going on elsewhere in Donbass. There are reports of advances and battles in all sorts of places, but it is around Slavatorsk Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, that the main fighting in Donbass appears likely to take place over the next few days or weeks. And in the meantime, there's also reports of a major build-up of Russian forces around Kharkiv. This is, of course, one city which the Russians encircled at the start of the war and from which they have not withdrawn from its outskirts. And there's apparently increasing nervousness that there's going to be a Russian offensive on Kharkiv as well. That's, of course, a much bigger place than Slavyansk or Kramatorsk and indeed Mariupol. So that could potentially be a very big battle indeed, though the size of the Ukrainian forces there, I'm not, of course, in any position to comment about. So the big battles continue to happen in Donbass. The Russians continue to advance. Mariupol is looking like increasingly a tragedy for Ukraine and its army. And media reporting in the West about all of this is dwindling, as I said, to a trickle. There's been more talk about arms supplies from the West to Ukraine. One of the ironies of all of this is that apparently it seems that the former Warsaw Pact countries are now complaining that they're largely out of weapon systems that they can send to Ukraine. So who knows how that's going to shape out. For the record, I don't think that these arms supplies are going to make any significant difference to the outcome of the war. But I understand that Victoria Nuland's European tour